The 3,200 people packed into Madison Square Garden on October 12, 1977, expected a typical Kiss concert. Explosions, fire breathing, the theatrical chaos that made them the hottest band in America. What they got instead was a masterclass in loyalty and standing up to corporate greed, delivered by a man who was about to publicly defy his own record label's decision to replace a talented session guitarist for the crime of being 28 years old and refusing to compromise his artistic integrity. But the audience didn't know that yet. They were screaming and throwing devil horns as Kiss performed their opening numbers, Energy Electric, the show proceeding with its usual pyrotechnic spectacle. The touring band members stood in the shadows, supporting the main performance, including Michael Torres, a session guitarist, who was playing with a knot in his stomach because he had just been told he was being replaced for not being commercial enough and too old to connect with Kiss's young fan base. The road crew knew something was different. Ace Frehley kept glancing toward the side stage between solos, his silver makeup unable to hide an expression they had never seen before. Was he planning something? Angry? About to explode? Then, about 50 minutes into the show, Ace did something completely unprecedented. He stopped mid-solo during Shock Me, walked to the edge of the stage, and gestured for the stage manager to bring Michael out from the wings. The crowd went confused, uncertain about what was happening. This wasn't part of the choreographed Kiss experience they had paid to see. Michael looked paralyzed, unsure whether this was real or some kind of sick joke. Ace grabbed his own microphone, something he rarely did during shows, and said something that would make headlines across the music world the next day. If you want to discover how one moment of defying corporate control changed the rock industry's treatment of session musicians, please subscribe to our channel. This story reveals the exploitation that still affects touring artists today. 4 hours before the show, Ace had been in the backstage production office going over set list changes when he overheard Bill Aucoin, Kiss's manager, talking with someone from Casablanca Records in one of the adjacent dressing rooms. What the label executive said next made Ace freeze and listen. "Michael, you've been solid, but let's be real here. You're 28 years old, and you've been in this business too long. You've got opinions, you push back on arrangements, you want credit for your contributions. We need younger guys who just play what they're told and don't ask questions. We need hungry musicians who won't challenge the system." Ace felt his blood pressure spike. He knew exactly what was happening because he had seen it throughout his career. The way the industry chewed up talented musicians and spit them out the moment they showed independence or demanded respect. Michael Torres wasn't just any session player. He was a virtuoso guitarist who had contributed significantly to the arrangements on several Kiss tracks, never receiving proper credit or compensation. Michael's response came quiet, disbelieving. "I'm being replaced because I have opinions about music. Because I'm 28? The executive's voice carried that casual cruelty that comes from people who see artists as interchangeable products. "This is the music business, kid. You either play the game or you get replaced by someone who will. We've got 100 guitarists who would kill for your spot and won't give us half the attitude. Nothing personal. Strictly business." Ace pushed open the door without knocking, startling both men. The record executive looked annoyed at the interruption, while Michael looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Ace addressed the executive directly, his voice carrying the edge that came before explosions. "What the hell did you just say to him?" The executive, clearly not intimidated by Ace's presence, repeated his position with corporate smoothness. The touring lineup needed to be streamlined, made more manageable. Michael was talented, sure, but his insistence on artistic input and proper crediting made him a liability in a system designed for efficiency and profit maximization. The label needed team players, not individuals who questioned decisions or demanded recognition. The argument that erupted was legendary among those who witnessed it. Ace called it corporate exploitation disguised as business practice, said they were treating musicians like replaceable parts rather than artists who contributed to Kiss's sound. Pointed out that if Michael's contributions were good enough to use on records, they were good enough to credit and compensate properly. The executive countered that Ace didn't understand how the industry worked, that session musicians were hired labor, not creative partners, that the business model depended on maintaining control over who got credit and compensation. The fight escalated until Ace threatened to walk off stage that night if Michael was fired, until the executive reminded him of contractual obligations and lawsuit potential. Ace left the office, but not before telling Michael directly, "You're not going anywhere. I don't care what they say. Be ready when I call you out tonight." Michael Torres had known this industry was brutal long before he started touring with Kiss. He was a guitarist who had spent his entire 20s grinding through session work, contributing to albums by major acts while watching other people's names appear in the credits for arrangements he had created. He had played on hit records, developed signature parts that became defining elements of songs, and received flat session fees while the artists and producers collected royalties for years. But this was different. This was being told at 28 years old that he was too old, too opinionated, too much of a problem for simply asking to be credited for his work. The words played on repeat in his mind as he prepared for what he assumed would be his final show with Kiss. Washed up at 28, too difficult, not hungry enough. What made it particularly crushing was that Michael knew his playing had never been better. He had developed a technical facility that took years to build, understood musical theory at a level that allowed him to enhance arrangements rather than just execute them, and brought a professionalism to touring that made the shows tighter and more powerful. His talent hadn't diminished, his work ethic hadn't changed, but none of that mattered if the label had decided he wasn't compliant enough for their business model. As he stood in the wings during the show, watching Kiss perform with the explosive energy that made them icons, he felt the weight of an entire career built on being invisible, on contributing creativity while others claimed ownership, on being treated as expendable the moment he asked for basic professional respect. The other session musicians knew what had happened, because word traveled instantly in the tight community of touring players who understood they were all one difficult conversation away from being replaced. They were sympathetic, but resigned. This was how the machine worked. This was what happened to musicians who had the audacity to believe their contributions deserved recognition. What none of them knew was that Ace Frehley had spent the last 4 hours planning something that would either get him sued or change how session musicians were treated. That Michael's humiliation was about to become a platform for exposing the exploitation built into the entire recording industry's power structure. When Ace stopped mid-solo during Shock Me, the band initially thought there was a technical problem with his guitar or amplifier, but Ace's body language showed determination rather than frustration as he walked to the stage edge and gestured for Michael to be brought out. The audience, confused by this departure from the Kiss spectacle they knew, went from screaming to uncertain murmuring. Michael looked terrified, having no idea what Ace was planning and fearing this might be some kind of public humiliation. Ace grabbed his microphone and addressed the crowd with an intensity that cut through even Madison Square Garden's massive space. "I want you to meet someone important," Ace said. his voice carrying a seriousness that contrasted sharply with his space ace persona. "This is Michael Torres. He's been playing with us for 18 months. He's one of the most talented guitarists I've ever worked with, and he's contributed to our sound in ways you've never heard about, because the record label won't let us credit him." The audience went quiet, sensing this was not part of the scripted show. Ace continued, his next words landing like grenades. "This afternoon, the label told Michael he's being fired. Want to know why?" The crowd was completely silent now, 3,200 people holding their collective breath. "Because he's 28 years old. That's apparently too old and too experienced. And because he had the nerve to ask for credit on songs he helped arrange. In their words, we need younger guys who shut up and play without asking questions." The reaction from the audience was immediate and visceral, a combination of shock and anger. Backstage, the record executive's face went white, while Bill Aucoin looked like he wanted to pull Ace off stage immediately. Ace wasn't finished. "So I wanted to do something tonight. I wanted you to hear what too old and too opinionated actually sounds like. Michael, get out here with your guitar. Let's show these people what the label thinks isn't good enough for Kiss." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most electrifying guitar performances in Madison Square Garden's history. Michael Torres, with his hands shaking from adrenaline and disbelief, launched into a solo that showcased everything the industry wanted to suppress. Technical virtuosity that came from years of dedication, creative phrasing that demonstrated genuine musicianship rather than just executing someone else's vision, and emotional depth that proved age and experience made you better, not obsolete. He played phrases that referenced classical music and jazz, showed influences from blues and progressive rock, demonstrated that he wasn't just a hired gun, but an artist with a complete musical vocabulary. The solo built in intensity and complexity, incorporating techniques that took years to master, telling a story through pure instrumental expression in a way that made it clear this was someone who understood music at a profound level. When Michael finished, the crowd erupted in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the building's foundation. People were screaming, throwing fists in the air, many visibly emotional at witnessing something that felt revolutionary. Ace let the moment continue. Let the applause build before he spoke again into the microphone. "That's what 28 and too opinionated sounds like. That's the guitarist someone wanted to throw away. Anyone here think he should be fired?" The crowd's response was deafening, a thunderous rejection of the label's decision. Ace turned toward where the executive stood in the wings, his next words directed as much at them as at the audience. "That settles it then. Michael stays, and I want to say something else." Ace addressed the crowd with a rawness that showed this wasn't just about one musician or one firing decision. What happened to Michael happens to session players all the time. They create parts, arrange songs, contribute to the sound that makes records successful, and then they get erased from the credits and replaced when they ask for recognition. They get told they're too old when they're barely out of their 20s. They get exploited by a system that treats them like tools instead of artists. I've watched it happen for years, and I'm done staying quiet about it. It's exploitation, it's wrong, and it needs to stop. The audience erupted again, with musicians in the crowd responding with particular intensity to finally hearing someone with power acknowledge what they had experienced or witnessed throughout their own careers. After the show, the confrontation between Ace and the record label executives was nuclear. They accused him of breach of contract, of damaging business relationships, of creating a precedent that would make session musicians unmanageable. Ace countered that they were running a plantation system that exploited musicians, that using legal contracts to silence artists was abuse of power, not legitimate business practice. The fight revealed a fundamental philosophical divide about what the music industry existed to do. The label saw musicians as content generators to be managed for maximum profit extraction, while Ace saw them as creative partners who deserved respect, credit, and fair compensation for their contributions. The argument ended with Ace drawing a line that would affect his entire future relationship with the label. He would no longer allow session musicians to work on KISS projects without proper crediting and compensation. Any contributions beyond basic performance would be credited and paid appropriately, or Ace would refuse to work with that producer or label representative. The executives could manage marketing, distribution, and business arrangements, but they could not treat musicians, particularly session players, as invisible labor to be exploited and discarded. For the label, this was an unacceptable challenge to their business model. For Ace, it was a necessary stand against exploitation he had benefited from for too long without challenging. Michael Torres continued working with KISS and went on to a successful career as both a session musician and eventually a producer, always properly credited for his work. But more importantly, what Ace did that night changed how Michael understood his own worth and gave him the courage to demand respect throughout his career. He became vocal about session musician rights, speaking at industry conferences about the exploitation that treated contributing artists as invisible labor while executives and headliners collected all the credit and profit. He talked openly about how Ace's public stand had not just saved his job, but had validated his worth as a musician rather than a replaceable tool. In interviews decades later, Michael credited that night with teaching him that fighting exploitation required people with power to risk that power on behalf of those without it. Ace could have handled Michael's situation quietly, could have negotiated backstage and kept it private, but by making it public, by forcing the audience and the industry to see the exploitation explicitly, he created a moment that couldn't be buried or dismissed. He used his platform not just to help one musician, but to challenge a system that harmed all session and touring players. The story of what Ace did for Michael Torres spread through the music industry like wildfire. Some praised Ace for exposing the exploitation of session musicians that was endemic in recording and touring. Others criticized him for violating industry protocols and for making business disputes public in a way that threatened the entire system's stability. But the conversation itself was transformative. For the first time, major music publications were writing about session musician exploitation, about the crediting systems that allowed producers and artists to claim ownership of arrangements they didn't create, about the age discrimination that treated musicians as obsolete before they hit 30. Some labels and producers began reconsidering their crediting and compensation policies. While change was slow and met with significant resistance, there was increased awareness that treating session musicians as invisible exploited labor was not just morally indefensible, but was causing the industry to lose talented artists. The conversation Ace started that night in 1977 contributed to broader movements that would eventually lead to better session musician contracts and more transparent crediting systems, though progress remained frustratingly incomplete. Ace Frehley's defense of Michael Torres wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that complicated his public image as the wild, unpredictable space ace. Behind the persona and the pyrotechnics, Ace had a consistent record of standing up for musicians who were being exploited by the industry's power structures. He fought for fair payment, demanded proper credits, and used his position to protect people who had less leverage. This doesn't make Ace perfect or erase other problematic aspects of his career and personal life. But it does show that he was capable of recognizing exploitation when he saw it, and willing to risk his own position to fight it, even when doing so created serious conflict with powerful industry figures. In 1977, when musicians were often dismissed as interchangeable parts in a corporate entertainment machine, Ace's public stand against exploitative labor practices was significant. It demonstrated that successful artists could be allies in fighting systemic exploitation, that using your platform to challenge injustice was more important than maintaining comfortable business relationships. Today, the music industry still struggles with session musician exploitation, crediting disputes, and age discrimination. Touring and session players still face pressure to accept unfair terms, still get replaced arbitrarily, still experience exploitation based on their position in the industry's power hierarchy. But the awareness has grown, and more musicians are willing to speak out against these practices. Stories like what Ace did for Michael Torres contribute to that change by providing historical examples of what solidarity looks like, what it means to use success and influence to defend people who have less of both. Michael himself became an advocate for younger session musicians, offering mentorship and sharing his story as an example that you don't have to accept exploitation quietly. He encouraged musicians to know their worth, to demand proper credit and compensation, to push back against systems designed to keep them invisible and underpaid. And he always credited Ace with showing him that fighting back was possible, that challenging power could work if you were willing to accept the consequences. The story of Ace defending Michael Torres offers several critical lessons that remain relevant today. First, that people with success and platform have a responsibility to use those advantages to fight systemic injustice, not just to advance their own careers. Ace could have stayed silent about Michael's firing, could have negotiated privately. But by making it public, he forced a larger conversation that benefited countless session musicians beyond just one guitarist. Second, that fighting exploitation sometimes requires personal risk and confrontation. Ace damaged relationships with his label, created legal tensions, and faced professional consequences for making a scene. But the alternative was allowing exploitative practices to continue unchallenged, and he decided that was unacceptable. Real solidarity isn't comfortable or safe. Third, that talent and worth aren't determined by age, compliance, or willingness to accept invisible exploitation. Michael Torres's performance that night proved what should have been obvious, that a talented 28-year-old musician with opinions and demands for fair treatment had exactly as much right to work and be credited as anyone else, that his value came from his artistry and contributions, not from his willingness to shut up and accept whatever terms were offered. On October 12, 1977, Ace Frehley could have performed a standard Kiss show, could have entertained his audience with explosions and fire-breathing, maintained comfortable industry relationships, and avoided conflict with powerful label executives. Instead, he chose to stop the show, bring an invisible session guitarist to center stage, expose the exploitative reasoning behind his firing, and challenge both his audience and his industry to recognize and reject the systemic abuse of musicians. It wasn't a complete solution to exploitation in the music business. One public stand doesn't erase all the problems or fix all the broken systems. But it was a moment when someone with power chose to use it for something that mattered. When a guitarist at the peak of his fame decided that fighting for fellow musicians was more important than maintaining safe business relationships. Michael Torres built a successful career, inspired other session players, and spent decades advocating for fair treatment of musicians. The record label executives never again tried to fire someone from a Kiss tour without expecting consequences. And 3,200 people in Madison Square Garden witnessed what it looked like when someone challenged exploitative practices publicly rather than accepting them as inevitable business reality. That's the legacy of that night. Not just that one musician kept his job, but that a conversation started, that systems were challenged, that people with power were shown that using that power for justice and solidarity was possible and necessary. Ace Frehley was the space ace, the wild man of Kiss. But on that night in New York, he was also an ally in the fight against exploitation, using his platform to amplify a fellow musician's voice and challenge an industry's abusive practices. That's worth remembering and celebrating.